There is something deeply unsettling about public generosity, especially when it comes from the hands of powerful people. History praises the kings who built magnificent temples, the emperors who covered mountains with monasteries, the billionaires who pledged fortunes large enough to feed entire nations. And perhaps humanity desperately wants to believe these acts were born purely from kindness. But history also whispers a darker possibility. What if generosity is sometimes a negotiation with guilt, a transaction between power and conscience? Ancient rulers once slaughtered thousands on battlefields, then spent rivers of gold building sacred monuments beneath the eyes of heaven. Modern billionaires dominate industry, crush competitors, reshape economies, then appear on global stages promising to save humanity through philanthropy. Different civilization, different language, yet perhaps the emotional instinct remains hauntingly familiar. The desire to cling out through visible compassion, because maybe the people who understand suffering most clearly are often the people who helped create it. And perhaps that is why the greatest public acts of generosity so often emerge from empires built through ruthless ambition. A strange contradiction, the same hand capable of destruction, suddenly presenting itself as merciful. Ancient kings feared divine judgment after death. Modern elites fear public judgment before death. And maybe both fears create remarkably similar behavior. Temples, churches, foundations, scholarships, hospitals carrying family names carved permanently into stone. Because power does not merely want to survive physically, it wants moral survival. It wants history to remember the kindness instead of the cruelty required to build the empire in the first place. Perhaps that is why philanthropy often feels emotionally complicated. Part compassion, part calculation, part fear. And maybe this makes human morality far more uncomfortable than we prefer admitting, because genuinely good acts can still emerge from imperfect motives. A hospital built for reputation still saves lives. A charitable foundation designed for legacy still changes the world. And perhaps history itself struggles to separate sincere compassion from strategic generosity completely. But one question continues echoing across centuries. Why are the most feared men so often obsessed with appearing benevolent? Maybe because deep down, even the powerful understand something terrifying. Money can purchase comfort. Power can command obedience. But neither can guarantee forgiveness. Not from history, not from society, and perhaps most frightening of all, not from themselves. Because maybe the grandest temples, the largest churches, and the biggest charitable foundations were never built only for the poor. Maybe they were built for the souls of the powerful people behind them, trying desperately to silence something within. Perhaps nowhere is the relationship between guilt and power more visible than in the temples built by violent rulers. History remembers many kings as conquerors, men who burned cities, executed rivals, expanded empires through rivers of blood, yet, strangely, many of these same rulers later devoted enormous fortunes to religion. Temples rising through mountain fog, golden Buddha statues towering toward heaven, monasteries echoing with prayers funded by men once feared across entire kingdoms. And maybe this reveals something profoundly human about power, because after conquering the external world, many rulers eventually become terrified of the internal one, their conscience. Ancient emperors understood something ordinary people rarely experience fully. Power often requires cruelty, not always because rulers enjoy violence, but because maintaining empires demands decisions capable of haunting the human mind forever. And perhaps religion became the only remaining court powerful enough to judge kings themselves. A battlefield could be conquered. Political enemies could be eliminated, but divine judgment remained untouchable. Perhaps this is why rulers throughout history poured unimaginable wealth into sacred construction, not merely to honor the gods, but to negotiate with them, each temple becoming a symbolic apology carved into stone, every golden statue whispering the same desperate plea: "Please remember my devotion instead of my brutality." Ancient chronicles often describe rulers donating land, gold, and labor to monasteries immediately after wars, almost as if violence itself created spiritual debt demanding repayment. And maybe psychologically, that is exactly what happened, because even the most ruthless leaders remained human enough to fear moral consequence. At night, after celebrations ended, after armies returned home, perhaps silence became unbearable. The faces of the dead, the villages destroyed, the realization that earthly power could not erase memory from the soul, and maybe temples offered emotional shelter from that fear. The illusion that enough generosity might outweigh destruction, enough prayer might soften judgment, enough sacred architecture might purchase peace internally. Perhaps this explains why some of history's bloodiest rulers also became history's greatest religious patrons, a contradiction modern civilization often struggles to understand. But maybe guilt and generosity were never opposites. Maybe they were partners, because the greater the violence used to build an empire, the greater the emotional need to justify that empire afterward. Ancient rulers could not control how future generations judged them, but they could shape what future generations saw. Magnificent temples, sacred monuments, public devotion, visible repentance large enough to overshadow invisible suffering. And perhaps that instinct survives today in more sophisticated forms, because maybe human beings never stopped trying to wash fear away with visible goodness. Only the architecture changed. In medieval Europe, salvation was rarely free. Kings, nobles, and powerful families understood something terrifying. Earthly power could protect the body, but not the soul. And perhaps that fear built some of the most magnificent churches humanity has ever seen. Towering cathedrals reaching toward heaven, colored glass glowing like divine fire, massive stone structures standing above entire cities, as if humanity itself was begging forgiveness from the sky. But behind the beauty often stood political calculation, because religion in medieval Europe was not merely spiritual, it was authority. To be blessed by the church was to transform political power into sacred power. A king crowned by religion no longer ruled only through force. He ruled through divine legitimacy, and perhaps that made generosity toward the church one of the most profitable investments in history. Land donations, gold offerings, funding monasteries, building cathedrals large enough to immortalize family names for centuries. Not simply acts of faith, but acts of survival, because rulers feared something greater than rebellion, condemnation, excommunication, the possibility that history and heaven might judge them together. And perhaps nowhere was this emotional contradiction darker than during the era of the Inquisition, an age where men publicly funded churches while privately participating in brutality. Torture chambers existing beneath symbols of compassion, executions carried out beneath towering crosses, a civilization preaching mercy while often practicing fear. And maybe that contradiction still feels disturbingly familiar today, because power has always understood the value of moral appearance. A feared ruler donating to religion appeared civilized. A ruthless, noble funding charity appeared compassionate. Public generosity became armor protecting reputations from moral scrutiny. And perhaps Ordinary people wanted to believe these acts represented redemption. Because if powerful people could change, then maybe civilization itself was not entirely corrupt. But history rarely offers simple morality. Some rulers genuinely believed their donations would save souls. Others likely understood religion more strategically, a partnership, protection in exchange for devotion. The church gained wealth, the ruler gained legitimacy, and society learned an important psychological lesson still visible centuries later. People often trust visible generosity more easily than invisible ethics. A cathedral can be photographed. A public donation can be announced. But private cruelty remains hidden behind palace walls. Perhaps this is why large acts of generosity sometimes create emotional confusion, because human beings instinctively associate giving with goodness, even when the source of that wealth remains morally complicated. And maybe medieval rulers understood human psychology better than we imagine. If history remembers your cathedral, perhaps it forgets your victims. If your name is carved into sacred stone, perhaps future generations hesitate to question how the empire was built. And perhaps that was the true genius behind these grand religious donations. Not simply worship, but narrative control. The attempt to shape memory itself. Long after the ruler disappeared into dust, modern billionaires no longer build temples from stone. They build foundations, institutions carrying family names across generations, universities, hospitals, global health programs, climate initiatives, scholarships designed to outlive the people who funded them. And perhaps this is the modern version of immortality. Ancient rulers once carved their names into marble pillars. Modern elites place their names on research centers and humanitarian organizations. Different architecture, same psychological instinct, the desire to survive history through public virtue, because perhaps wealth eventually reaches a strange emotional limit. After a certain point, luxury stops feeling meaningful. Another mansion changes nothing internally. Another private jet creates no real peace. And maybe that is when the wealthy begin searching for something far more powerful than comfort. Legacy. Not merely being rich, but being remembered as good. Perhaps that is why modern philanthropy often feels almost spiritual in scale. Billions donated to eradicate diseases, transform education, reshape global agriculture, influence the future of entire societies. These are no longer ordinary acts of charity. They resemble private civilizations operating beside governments themselves. And maybe that is why foundations have become the cathedrals of modern power. Not places of worship for God, but monuments to moral influence. Because unlike businesses, charitable foundations possess something emotionally unique. They allow power to appear compassionate permanently. A corporation seeks profit. A foundation seeks humanity, at least publicly. And perhaps this distinction matters deeply to wealthy individuals approaching old age. Because near the end of life, public image begins competing with personal conscience. How will history describe me? As a monopolist, a ruthless capitalist, or as a savior? Perhaps foundations offer a psychological bridge between those identities, a chance to rewrite narrative before time runs out. And maybe society willingly participates in this transformation because people desperately want powerful individuals to become benevolent eventually. We want redemption stories. We want to believe success can evolve into wisdom, that immense wealth might eventually return something meaningful back to humanity. But modern philanthropy also creates uncomfortable questions. When one private foundation controls resources larger than national governments, who truly shapes society? Elected leaders or unelected billionaires? deciding which problems deserve attention. And perhaps this is where modern charity begins resembling ancient empires once again, because both systems allow enormous private power to influence millions of lives while appearing morally justified. Ancient rulers built temples where citizens gathered spiritually. Modern elites build foundations where societies gather economically and medically. Both become centers of influence, extending far beyond generosity itself. And maybe that is why billion-dollar philanthropy often feels emotionally complicated. Part kindness, part strategy, part legacy building, part quiet negotiation with mortality. Because perhaps every great foundation ultimately asks the same ancient question. When history judges enormous power, can generosity outweigh everything that came before it? Perhaps one of the most uncomfortable truths about modern philanthropy is that generosity can also be financially intelligent, not illegal, not necessarily immoral, but strategic. And maybe this is where many ordinary people begin feeling emotionally conflicted about billionaire charity. Because modern foundations do something ancient temples never could. They preserve influence while reducing financial loss. In ancient times, rulers donated gold to religion and lost direct control over it. But modern philanthropic systems often operate very differently. A billionaire can transfer enormous wealth into a private foundation, receive major tax advantages, and still influence how that money is distributed for decades. Perhaps this is why some critics describe philanthropy as the most sophisticated form of reputation management ever created. Not because charitable work is fake. Many foundations genuinely improve millions of lives, but because the system itself also protects wealth structurally. And maybe history has always rewarded generosity most generously when it comes from the powerful. Because governments understand something simple. If wealthy elites voluntarily fund social problems, the state carries less burden itself. And perhaps this creates a fascinating psychological paradox. Society praises philanthropy as selfless, while the financial architecture behind it often remains deeply practical. Tax deductions, asset protection, inheritance management, long-term institutional control. These are not emotional concepts. They are strategic ones. And perhaps this is why billionaire philanthropy sometimes feels less like pure charity and more like empire management, evolving into a softer form. Because power rarely disappears voluntarily. It transforms. Ancient kings once controlled land through armies. Modern elites often control influence through foundations, think tanks, universities, and global initiatives. Different tools, same continuity of reach. And maybe the most psychologically fascinating part is that both things can be true simultaneously. A charitable foundation can sell lives while also preserving wealth. A billionaire can sincerely want to help humanity while also protecting financial legacy. Human morality is rarely clean, especially at the highest levels of power, because once fortunes become enormous enough, money itself stops behaving. History rarely remembers powerful people exactly as they truly were. It remembers the version that survived. And perhaps no force shapes survival more effectively than public perception, because throughout history, the wealthy have understood something profoundly important. Human beings forgive more easily when they are emotionally inspired. A feared ruler funding orphanages, an industrial titan building hospitals, a billionaire photographed beside starving children. These images possess extraordinary psychological power, not because they erase past behavior completely, but because they complicate it. And perhaps complexity is the safest refuge for powerful people. Because once society begins debating whether someone was good or bad, absolute condemnation becomes harder. Maybe
And
this
so
is
we
why
must remember that
philanthropy
true
evolved
wealth
into
is
one of the
measured not in
greatest
profit, but in
reputation
the
tools ever
generosity we show to
created.
those less
Not
fortunate.
fake kindness necessarily, but strategic visibility. A public stage where power can redesign memory itself. Perhaps no historical example illustrates this more clearly than the great industrial tycoons of America. Men who built unimaginable fortunes during brutal economic eras. Workers exhausted inside dangerous factories. Monopolies crushing competition. Entire industries controlled by a handful of families. And yet later in life, many of these same men transformed into symbols of generosity. Modern elites build charitable narratives after decades of aggressive capitalism. Different language. Same psychological survival mechanism. Because perhaps human beings cannot tolerate seeing themselves as villains permanently. Even the ruthless seek moral reflection eventually. And maybe society participates willingly in this transformation because redemption stories comfort us emotionally. We want to believe success eventually becomes wisdom. That age softens greed into compassion. That enormous power can evolve into something humane before the end. But perhaps the greatest fear of powerful people is not death itself, but disappearance. The terrifying possibility that history may eventually move forward without remembering their names. Ancient rulers feared their tombs would be destroyed, their statues shattered, their dynasties erased by future generations. And maybe modern billionaires fear something remarkably similar, not physical destruction, but historical irrelevance. Because immense wealth changes the way human beings think about time. Ordinary people often focus on surviving the present. The powerful begin thinking in centuries. How will future generations remember me? What story will survive after my body disappears? And perhaps this explains why philanthropy becomes increasingly important near the end of life. Not simply as charity, but as historical architecture. A mechanism designed to preserve identity long after death. Ancient kings built pyramids, temples, and monuments carrying their names. Modern elites build foundations, research institutes, climate initiatives, and educational systems intended to outlive them. Different structures, same emotional ambition, the desire to remain psychologically alive through civilization itself. Perhaps this is why wealthy individuals often become obsessed with attaching their names permanently to public institutions, libraries, hospitals, universities, entire global programs, because memory feels more durable when carved into society physically. And maybe deep down, they understand something profoundly frightening. Financial numbers eventually become meaningless. The richest man in one century becomes an obscure footnote in another, but moral legacy that survives longer. People still remember rulers described as wise, compassionate, visionary, even centuries after their empires collapsed. And perhaps this creates an emotional race against time. Eventually, every empire becomes silent. The temples crack, the statues fade, the foundations change leadership, and even the wealthiest names in history slowly drift into dust. Perhaps this is the final lesson power struggles to accept. Nothing human remains untouched by time. Not kings, not billionaires, not even the stories they carefully built about themselves. Because history is strangely patient. It waits, and after enough decades pass, the noise disappears. Public relations vanish. Political influence fades. Media narratives collapse. And what survives is often something far simpler, character, not but perhaps the tragedy begins when compassion becomes
This reorganization
strategy instead of
simplifies the
instinct,
ownership structure
when helping
significantly,
others
ensuring
becomes
compliance
inseparable
across
from
all
protecting
entities.
image, because then morality slowly transforms into performance. And maybe modern civilization rewards performance more than sincerity. A carefully staged donation receives more attention than decades of quiet kindness. A billionaire saving thousands becomes globally celebrated. An ordinary person sacrificing daily for family remains invisible. Yet perhaps invisible goodness matters more than history realizes, because civilizations survive not only through institutions, but through ordinary trust between human beings, neighbors helping neighbors, parents protecting children, strangers comforting one another during suffering. These small acts never dominate headlines, but they quietly hold societies together long after empires collapse. And perhaps this is the uncomfortable irony of power. The people most desperate to be remembered forever are often remembered less warmly than ordinary individuals who simply lived with decency. Because maybe love survives longer than influence. Maybe integrity survives longer than reputation. Maybe humanity survives longer than legacy itself. And perhaps that leaves us with one final question. If eventually all wealth becomes dust, what kind of person should we become before that moment arrives? Maybe that answer matters far more than any monument carrying our name.